I'm Francisco Gonzalez. I am the newly appointed Executive Director of the Economic Club of Miami. I actually attended my first Economic Club of Miami event, like many of you, in November with Ken Griffin and Mayor Suarez. And I want to thank the board of the Economic Club. They've just done a phenomenal job starting this club, getting it going in the last 2 years. One of the board members is here, Lourdes Castillo. She's back there. Some of you might have met Jeremy Schwartz. He was in here earlier. He'll be back. He just stepped out for a minute. Jeb Bush Jr. I don't think could make it tonight, and then of course John Hartley, who also is not here, and that's probably why I'm here because John's worked really, really hard, and I think was very thankful to have someone else kind of move into this role a little bit more. But I just want to thank you for being here. I know that this club is growing now. We have about 50 members of the club and continuing to grow. I've only been on board for about 2 weeks, and I can't keep up with your emails yet with all your applications. So I know there's some new applicants in here, and I will get to you in the next week or so. But a lot going on with trying to put together this event and other things. So thank you. If you're interested in joining the club as a member, the membership information is on the website. So you go to econClubMiami.com. Is it .com or .org? .com, right? And see, I'm still learning. And but the membership information is there. You can apply. You basically send in an application, and then once you're accepted, it's a $500 annual membership. You get invited. Complimentary membership to all the events. We'll have some meet and greets with some of the speakers, other things that we're developing as well, including a membership directory and other things. So just check that out, and we'll continue to keep you updated on events. Also, I just wanted to mention, I know somebody asked me like, what, a little bit about Francisco. Where are you from? What are you doing? I was actually born right here in Miami. My father and grandparents came to the United States when my dad was 7 years old in 1960. They first actually landed here in Miami, but in 1960 there was very few Cubans here. So they actually went to New York for almost a decade, and then they had moved to Miami a little bit later. And so my dad and my grandparents actually get to claim 2 migrations, one from Cuba and one from New York. So that would be very, very much like many people in Miami. But I also, as I reflect on seeing Miami grow over my last 4.5 decades of life here in South Florida, I mostly grew up in Broward County, and but really just now it's like kind of crazy because many of you know that you're from South Florida, you're from Miami. This place has always been entrepreneurial. It's always had an entrepreneurial spirit to it. It's also been a safe haven for people looking for economic freedom. But it's kind of interesting in the last few years that Miami is sort of having I might call it a global moment, right? So many more people are recognizing and taking Miami even more seriously, right? It's not just a place that people party on South Beach and go to Miami Heat games and things like that. Or I was told that once the Miami Dolphins had a perfect season, I think before I was born. But anyway, so it's not just that place anymore. It's now becoming a very serious place, and we really felt that having an economic club is going to help Miami take an even more serious look internally as it continues to grow and has to deal with many different challenging issues. And as we look to other places that maybe have been great, New York, San Francisco, other places in the sea, that those places have become very, in some ways segregated, rich and poor, right? There's not a lot of upward mobility in a lot of those cities anymore. New York maybe more than San Francisco, but I think for Miami to remain the place that it was for my dad and my grandparents, we really need to tackle some of the challenges to make sure upward mobility is still something that can happen here. And so it's great that we have a lot of great leaders here, and we have a lot of you here, and a lot of people putting their minds together towards that. And we have 2 amazing gentlemen here tonight that are also going to talk to us about some of these things that they've seen where they've been located in places as far as Israel and Silicon Valley. So let me introduce them. One other thing I should mention about myself is that I've had a podcast called the Agents of Innovation Podcast, where I interview a lot of entrepreneurs. And about 1.5 years ago, I had the opportunity, a mutual friend connected me with Michael Eisenberg, and so I was able to interview him for one of my episodes. But this was the first time we met in person because we were doing it by Zoom then, and so but it was really, really great to get to know him. And I actually just put a new book out. I handed it to him tonight. It's a book of a lot of entrepreneurial stories from people I've interviewed. So I got a whole chapter on him in that book. So it's pretty cool to be able to hand it to him tonight. But Michael is the general partner at Aleph. That's spelled A-L-E-P-H. It is an early stage venture capital fund with about $850 million under management. Aleph focuses on partnering with great Israeli entrepreneurs to build large, meaningful companies and impactful global brands. Since its founding in 2013, Aleph has invested in over 50 companies, including maybe a few you've heard of like Lemonade, Frank, Melio, Healthy.io, Simply Fabric, Honeybook and Bringg. Prior to Aleph, Michael was a general partner at Benchmark Capital, which he joined in July of 2005, and where he continues as the partner responsible for Benchmark's Israeli portfolio. Michael has focused on internet and software-enabled service investments since 1995. And I should also mention he has been writing since 2006 a blog called 6 Kids and a Full-Time Job on topics ranging from politics to technology, Judaism, and macroeconomics. However, he has 8 children now, and I think a few grandchildren mixed in there. He was a contributor to The Marker, a Hebrew language daily newspaper, and is the author of the Hummus Manifesto, the seminal piece on Israel's innovation scene. He's published a number of books. One that I read that is really fantastic called Tree of Life and Prosperity, and the subtitle is 21st Century Business Principles from the Book of Genesis. So I can no longer read the Bible the same anymore after reading Mike's book because you see economics everywhere in the Old Testament, particularly the book of Genesis. He really pulled out all these amazing economic lessons from there, and I think maybe he'll hit on some things tonight related. So, he lives in Jerusalem, like I said, with his wife and 8 children, and we also have here Antonio Garcia Martinez, who is a New York Times best-selling author of a book called Chaos Monkeys, Obscene Fortune and Random Failure in Silicon Valley. He has been an advisor to Twitter, a product manager at Facebook, a strategist with Goldman Sachs. As a PhD student in physics at the University of California, Berkeley, he looked for a gig on Wall Street as a way out of academia. Later, as Wall Street crashed, sounds like he looked for a way out to Silicon Valley, and as a tech entrepreneur. And he documents a lot of these experiences in his book, Chaos Monkeys. He's also a senior fellow with the Lincoln Network and co-host of a new podcast called Moment of Zen. So I'm going to welcome these two up here for a little fireside chat. They're going to engage in a topic that we picked out called Decaying Institutions, Technology, and Humanity. And the format tonight is they're each going to introduce each other, introduce a little topic, and then they're going to ask each other some questions. We'll do that for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take the last 20 minutes for some questions from you all for them. So I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
So great to be here. Does this work?
Testing. This one works.
Okay.
Is it on? I'm not on.
You got content moderated too.
You gotta turn it on.
It's on.
Francisco, thank you for the warm introduction. It's so great to meet in person finally. Thank you for having us here. Antonio and I also met online, as many people did during the pandemic. And since we've become friends and even partners in his business venture. And so what I thought we'll do is start with Antonio introducing himself for a couple minutes. I'll do the same, and then we'll get into banter back and forth about the topic you may have come to hear about, but we may take in other directions also. So,
Sure. It's funny, when Francisco was telling his bio, it reminded me of my own, as I was telling you when we were standing outside. If you look outside, you see a little red building on the right. That's obviously the Freedom Tower, which is now dwarfed by all the surrounding buildings, but used to be the high-rise building in Old Miami. And my father came through as a Cuban exile alone. He was 17, and he walked out through the ground floor, which is now, of course, a museum to the Cuban exile. And he would always remind me when I was whining about something that, when I got to this country, I only had, I walked out of Freedom Tower with 3 things in my pocket. What was it? It was a Spanish-English dictionary, a plastic safety razor, and a bus stick to Chicago, where he had like a distant uncle or something. And so he's always told me that was his background. So yeah, I was in fact raised here. As Francisco pointed out, there wasn't much to Miami in 1960. You wouldn't hang around for a lot of economic opportunity. I was actually born in California, but then we moved shortly after to Miami. I was raised here. Went to Belen Jesuit, the local, imported Cuban Jesuit school. And then I fled as soon as I could at 18, because of course Miami seemed at the time like a little bit of a provincial backwater, and like, oh, I got to go to New York or San Francisco or whatever. And it's so funny, if you had told me in 18 that like Andreessen Horowitz and the firms and people we know are either living here or moving here or doing business here, I would have said, you're totally crazy, it's impossible. It's funny, I often get asked, like, do you think this tech thing in Miami is taking off? Are people actually going to move here? I'm like, I don't know. The city has taken in, refugees from failed left-wing regimes like Cuba, Venezuela, California, all the time. Like, it's a common thing. That's what the city does. It might stick. Who knows? So yeah, and then more recently, I find myself spending a lot more time here, and I just happen to overlap. So that's good news.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
And I should mention Antonio started what they call a Web3 company.
Oh.
And by the way, I should just say, you got two guys in the tech industry speaking up here. So if there's something that we say that you don't understand the term, feel free to say, hey, what the hell is that? We just started a new Web3 company called Spindle.
Yep.
You want to take 1 second and talk about your experience at Facebook and now what you're doing now?
You can't not pump your company. He was an investor in it, so that he's obviously plugging it. So a lot of what's in Chaos Monkeys, this book, this self-plug even further. I was an early member of the Facebook ads team, so a lot of, if you go browse the internet and you see some of that stuff in your Instagram feed, you can blame me for that. I built some of the early versions of that. So a lot of that hasn't happened on the Web3 crypto space. So all this stuff you might be hearing about NFTs and cryptocurrencies, all this stuff, there's no way to actually measure usage and monetization, and kind of a lot of the flywheel that you see on the Web2 side doesn't exist. And so we're kind of building a lot of that. So app developers can actually drive user retention, drive users, get them monetized, see where they're going. Like Web3, I know it's almost like a joke, like, oh, it's early. It is early. It feels like the 90s when it comes to like conventional Web 1 and Web 2. And so we're trying to advance it a little bit faster.
So my background is, from my accent, I'm not originally Israeli, although I'm living in Jerusalem for 30 years. I grew up in New York and went to school in New York. And right after college, I moved to Israel. I started my career in political consulting for about a year and a half. And then I figured out that you don't create a lot of job or economic opportunity being in political consulting. And my passion in life was creating jobs and enabling economic prosperity. And one thing led to another, meaning I was unemployed. Because the political regime changed in Israel, as it does fairly often for those of you who follow the news. And I found myself in a version of venture capital business, and I've been investing for the last, since I guess 1995, so I was at 27 years in Israel, in Israeli tech companies. And I've been kind of fortunate enough to invest in a bunch of companies that have gone on to international notoriety. But part of being in Israel is that it's a small country. Despite how much it's in the news, it's only about 9.5 million people. And so I traveled a ton, like once a month to Silicon Valley for 25 years almost. And since I stopped traveling to Silicon Valley most of the time, I now go to New York and increasingly over the last year and a half to Miami. Personal background, Francisco described. I'm married to Yafa, 8 children, 4 grandchildren, and I've authored, 8 books at this point, most of which are at the intersection of the Bible and economics and technology. I know it sounds like an odd topic. 2 of them are in English so far. The other 6 I wrote in Hebrew. But like Francisco said, I think if you look at kind of the timeless wisdom of the Bible and you think it dealt with everyday life, we spend most of our life working and in the economic sphere. So if the Bible has anything to say relevant to what we're talking about in modern times, it has to do with work, money, and the economy. And so that's the background. I'll start off by asking you a question.
Okay.
So the kind of topic today is decaying institutions. To give a little background, we all kind of feel, I think, that there's the kind of pace of technology and the way we communicate almost instantly, and then there's the pace of institutions and government. I think we all kind of feel that institutions have set ideologies that are kind of encrusted almost in those institutions, whereas the kind of more open space of digital land is more heterodox than many of these institutions. How are those two things going to live side by side over the coming years and decades?
No, I think it's a good question. So, I mean, it's funny. I was having a conversation with someone whose work you've probably read. I'm not going to name drop her. You probably guess who it is. She bought dinner, and we're debating it. And this is somebody who's worked in media and got sort of canceled. That's like a thing now to get canceled. Another thing I wouldn't have imagined 20 years ago is people getting canceled. In any case, she got sort of canceled, and she was defending the institution that had canceled her, right? And it was weird to me, because to me, working in tech, I think in general, I tend to be anti-institutionalist, and I realized one of the big divides, I think when people we have conversations with, it's not left versus right, it's not necessarily tech versus media, East Coast versus West Coast. It's like, do you believe there is a center with institutions that are worth preserving, that can be reformed, and that should exist? Or do you think that it's time to burn it all down and build something else? And I think if you apply, and obviously I'm binarizing it to kind of like, to differentiate between them, it's obviously more of a spectrum, but I think you can apply that filter to most avenues of life and realize that most people are sorted into one of two bins, right? Either they think there's a center worth preserving, or they think the system is so corrupt it must be basically utterly replaced. And I think in tech, you have a lot more of the latter, right? You have people who think, yeah, we're just gonna, that's it. We're gonna like nuke the New York Times, it's gonna be Substacks and Twitter and whatever else, and that's the end of it, right? Or it's gonna be, instead of conventional nation states, it's gonna be the network state, which those of you who haven't read it, there's a tech influencer named Balaji, who also was an entrepreneur, and I think we probably know Balaji as well. He's quite a character online. He has a new book called The Network State, and the idea here is that, we're going to live in these network cities, almost like a Hanseatic League, but of a more crypto flavor. And so they're willing to sort of demolish the network state, or the nation state for the network state. I don't know. I think it's hard for me to predict it. Part of me says, yeah, screw it, like nuke it all and build something new. Part of it's like, realistically, I'm not sure that's going to quite work. But yeah, I think the feeling is that something needs to change, and the only question is whether it's reform or revolution, I guess.
When you talk about institutions for a second, what are the kinds of institutions?
Universities.
Universities, what's another one? Media.
Mainstream media.
Mainstream media. What else?
The church?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I wouldn't.
Well, why wouldn't you say that?
I mean, one of the few things you can actually, in changing times, one of the few things you can actually cling to is, I think, religion. I cited in my piece, I wrote this, so it's a long story, I'm going to read you Judaism, it's kind of complicated. But in Judaism, in Simchat Torah, when you parade the Torah, one of the things that you cite at the end is that it's the tree of life that, what is it? You probably know better than I do. It's a tree of life that
you hold on to.
That you hold on to, right? So I think religion in some ways is actually a ballast in a changing world. So I don't know that I would nuke the Catholic Church.
No, I wouldn't nuke it, I'm saying those were like, you guys heard, the question was, what are institutions that are,
right.
the main ones?
I don't know. I think religion is interesting. I think a lot of people are creating sort of fake religions as basically, friend of mine joked, if they're trying to control what you eat or who you have sex with, then it's a religion, right? And so there's a lot of that going around, as it were. And so, yeah, I think it's difficult to impossible to actually live a truly atheist sort of nihilist life. I think it literally is impossible. If you actually talk to most people, they actually aren't living the life that would imply. So I think religion is actually going to make a comeback, whether it's in good or bad form is a whole other thing. But what else? Yeah.
By the way, just to take a sidebar on that, I completely agree with that. I think religion's about to make a big comeback. I think, Silicon Valley on some level, where you're now spending more time, but had kind of escaped for a while, and I've kind of escaped, has embraced the religion of Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Sapiens, which is, on some level, vacuous and a made up story that they like to tell themselves. And you can't hear me? And so there was this kind of, I think, moment of nihilism, which was kind of, peak nihilism, I think, that kind of took hold about, probably peaked 2 or 3 years ago before the pandemic. And now we've gone over the other side, where I think the embrace of religion is coming back. It's one of the things I discovered by writing the book, is that people are actually in this world which seems to be kind of tilting back and forth between extremes. People are looking for timeless principles to hold on to,
right?
Whether it's in family life or the economy or in relationships at work or kind of what transcends politics at some point. And I agree with you. I think it's making a big comeback right now.
Yeah.
So why should we preserve these institutions? So people spend, $80,000 a year to go to Harvard to get, 2 or 3 letters next to their name. Pay for some sort of credentialing system. I'll say openly, so my oldest son didn't go to college. He did spend 4.5 years as an officer in the military. He's doing fine, thank you. Working at a startup. My son will do the same. He was wounded in the battles in Gaza. That's a life experience. It's hard to pick up in college. And he's also going to college. He's doing fine. And so why go and spend $80,000 in these institutions? Why send your kids to these places, which are kind of ideological indoctrinators at this time? Well, why should we preserve these institutions?
It's funny, I was having this debate literally in these private, group chats that we're all in, or, at least I am in. I was taking the other side and usually was like, well, where would peer research go? It's like, well, a lot of peer research has been shown to be irreproducible. I'm like, what's the point of it even? Hard to say. I mean, I would say that I think we've lived in such a post-World War II liberal triumphalist bubble, and that things have actually worked pretty well, that it's hard to imagine another world. I'll give you a simple example. The education world, I don't feel I know that well. But the media space, I feel I know well because I've written a book, I've written fact-check reportage from Cuba for Wired Magazine. Like, I've done the journalist thing, right? And I've sort of seen it on the inside.
I find when you write a book, you find it's pretty dysfunctional on how the sausage is made back then.
It can be. I mean, yeah. But what's the alternative, I guess? But
fair.
But yeah, in the media case, right, if you look at the history of journalism, right, this business of like fact-checked bipartisan reportage, which is mostly ad-supported, by the way, like that's only existed since basically the end of World War II. Between World War I and World War II, that's when journalism began. If you go look at the original founders, Ben Franklin, by the way, reborn today, would be in a non-account shitposter on Twitter with like 20 anons, literally posting people. He would get content moderated. He would be a disaster, right? He literally would post anonymous pamphlets. I mean, the Federalist Papers were basically an anonymous publication. Things used to be a lot more sort of spirited and bare knuckle, and journalism was much more partisan by its very nature. The notion of objectivity or fact-checking was unheard of. And so you can imagine different forms of media. Of course, that was a very politically volatile time. We had a disastrous civil war. I mean, there's a lot of bad stuff that happened as well. But you can imagine another world in which you do have institutions that just don't look at all like the current ones.
What would they look like?
Man, it's just Substackers all day. No.
What are Substackers?
Oh, sorry. Do you guys not know what it is? Shit. Oh God. Okay. So Substack is basically blogging, but the idea is it's coupled with a subscription model, and they kind of aggregate it into one site. And so I have a Substack, and they had a traditional publishing model, and they would pay advances to noted authors. So Andrew Sullivan, Matt Iglesias, Matt Taibbi, a lot of people who were successful conventional journalists came to Substack and are making a lot more, frankly. These numbers are open because you can see the subscription ratings in the leaderboard. Matt Iglesias and Andrew Sullivan are making north of $1 million easy a year, just basically blogging, right? It's interesting. It's a different model. It's pamphleteering of a form, which again resembles 19th century journalism way more than the New York Times does, but in many ways they have a lot more impact as well.
So, there's like an odd mic. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Is that better when he's closer?
Yes.
Yeah. If you guys are closer. It's like an echo.
Testing.
Does that work?
Yes.
Oh man. We're like Castro giving a speech here. We're just gonna be yelling to the crowd for hours.
I got a pretty loud voice to start,
Okay.
so that's better?
Much better.
All right. So that's actually like a good economic point. I think it's important to dwell on for a second. So we had institutions, and institutions gave imprimatur to people. So the New York Times made Thomas Friedman important, just as an example.
Right.
But now you got star power. And by the way, right, Matt Taibbi, Andrew Sullivan making $1 million a year on Substack because their individual brand goes up is like the equivalent of LeBron James.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you look everywhere right now, individual stardom matters more economically than the brand imprimatur.
Yeah.
Play this world forward for us where the individual who is uniquely talented and maybe creative takes the bulk of the cake or the bulk of the economic profit that comes out of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right? Like, I'm dropping these names as if anybody can go and make $1 million on Substack, and it's not that easy. I mean, I wasn't making $1 million a year on Substack. It was a non-trivial sum, right? Like enough to live off of, but it was not. So the graph of like the distribution of return looks extraordinarily fat head, long tail, as you would say. I think it's much more, brands and institutions don't matter. It's much more individuals. It's influencers. I had one of the lines people like quoting from my book is that like, he was wrong. We're not all going to be famous for 15 minutes in the future. We're going to all of us be famous 24/7 to 15 people, right? Everyone is going to have their own audience and have their own brand, which is, I think, true. I mean, I have more than 15 followers, but it's not a million either. It's somewhere between. And yeah, it's weird, right? Because it is very individualized, right? It's not an institution. It's hard to build institutions now, I think, is the problem. Getting back to the network state, Balaji cites Zionism as an example, right? And I kind of joke tweet, oh, this network state business is like Zionism without Judaism. And like, can you even build a new political entity, right? Like, can you, like, I don't know, like Miami, for example, it'd be really cool if it were like a city state. If it were like the equivalent of Singapore, Dubai, arguably it might be better, right? You'd have different immigration policy, different taxation policy. You know, you just have different, it's a different thing, frankly, than I think, than the rest of the state of Florida, right? You go to the Panhandle, it doesn't feel like Miami, right? Clearly Miami's a different thing, and arguably it should be its own city state. Why can't we create that institution, right?
So let's back up for a second
Sure.
and talk about the network state. You compared it to Zionism, right?
Yeah.
Zionism, for those, it's not the state of Israel. It's it was a precursor to it. It started 70 years before and gathered people around an idea that then became a state. But the state, or the physical piece of land, was actually important to it. Balaji, Picturevison, who both of us know, has argued that this network state is kind of this loose digital affiliation of people that can kind of live anywhere, but be a part of the same virtual state. And when we're talking, you could say like Miami, Tel Aviv, San Francisco, and New York. By the way, Miami would be at the bottom of the list, are probably, right?
Yeah, it depends.
Not for quality of life, for kind of most innovative.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, technologically, or like a cluster of call it cities
Yeah.
that form a unique entity. People can kind of bounce around from those places and never feel like they left the same place almost, right?
It's not even the entire city, right? It's like literally downtown Brooklyn, Wynwood. It's like Soma, Mission, Fidei, Noe Valley in San Francisco. It's like 4 neighborhoods in New York. It literally is that. Like, imagine this thought.
It's all of Tel Aviv, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It's a small place.
But imagine you actually had an international border around those cities and you literally had to show a passport when you left. Like the people who live in that state, like me, like we wouldn't even notice. Like, because that's not true. I like LARPing as a redneck and I have like a house in the red state and I go and like behave like a redneck. But most people would like never leave 3 or 4 neighborhoods in like the 4 or 5 cities in the United States. That's right. The network state basically exists, although it doesn't exist as such, so to speak. Yeah.
How do you think about, here, I'll back up for a second. You know, one of the things I explore in the book, The True Life and Prosperity, is what's the responsibility of people who are successful to empower others outside of those areas and kind of their immediate sphere of influence to become successful in their own right. Training them with skills, empowering them to be economically successful, etc. And it feels like, and I think this is kind of a popular canard almost, and you know, some politicians like to make grist out of this, is you know, like the tech economy and entrepreneurs and has kind of disconnected from the rest of society and lost its sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
For it. When we talk about like a network state between Tel Aviv, New York, San Francisco, and Miami, you kind of feel like the same thing.
Yeah.
How do you think that group of people
Yeah.
has to feel in terms of their responsibility to others?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real critique, right? Like, I think everyone's seen the videos coming out of San Francisco. It's a little bit of a dystopia. I mean, it looks worse on Twitter than it is, but it's not totally wrong. Like, SF is basically kind of falling apart. And there's parts that you walk through that look like a hellscape, and it's just what it is. And how is it that, like, the scene of the biggest legal wealth creation, possibly in a century, looks like a sci-fi horror movie most of the time? Like, in my neighborhood in San Francisco, like, no joke, late at night you drive around and there's all these expensive autonomous vehicles with LiDAR on them, literally navigating themselves around homeless people in encampments. It is like the most dystopic thing you have ever seen. That's the scene me driving home late at night at 10 p.m. from the startup. It's like literally falling behind little LiDAR cars and like homeless people wandering around. And that's how I drive home. How did that happen, right? And I think one thing you can critique tech for is like, they don't feel that level of civic investment in the city that I think, you know, the giants of the past would have felt, right? Like you go to any institution in New York, the Met, for example, and it's literally a list of all the wealthy people and wealthy corporations and the thing that give back and in some sense compete for prestige, let's be clear, right? Because getting a ticket to the Met Gala is like a big thing, right? To basically fund public institutions that we care about. And somehow that reflex among techies doesn't exist. What they do, how they give back, is they reinvest in future companies and angel funds and stuff. And so they do create value. They don't just sit there on the beach all day. On the contrary, like they never stop working, but somehow that connection to civic belonging doesn't exist. And I agree, it's a problem, and I don't know how to fix it.
I gave a talk at Harvard, I guess now 6 weeks ago, in Professor Roland Fryer's class, a person I hold in tremendously high regard. about kind of the future of capitalism. And capitalism very clearly is under assault right now. And one of the things I said there that I guess raised a lot of eyebrows or people got their backs up is it feels like our entire discourse today in society is what are my rights? And people saying, you know, my right to this, the Bill of Rights has been extended to a million other rights, and these are my rights, and kind of leave me alone on some level. And I wondered out loud whether people in general, young people in particular, tech people also need a Bill of Responsibilities, and not just a Bill of Rights. It feels, I'll make a religious argument on some level, that part of religious education, to the question asked earlier, is a Bill of Responsibilities.
Yeah.
That's maybe gone away as religion has receded in the public sphere and in education. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's funny when you're saying that. One thing you can do when you go home is Google has what's called basically search statistics, or what's called an Ngram viewer. So they've ingested all of Google books and basically just show you how popular words were through time. And if you look up rights versus duty, you'll see duty go like this, and rights go like this over the course of the past 2 centuries. And it's just, I don't know, it's been ingrained in what is the liberal matrix. Like, I think Rod Dreher, who's this like super conservative author I interviewed on my podcast, he said, you know, liberalism is the quest to free the individual from any unchosen obligation, right? That is the quest of current liberalism. And if you go back to John Stuart Mill and the original classical liberals, that was kind of baked in there as well. And yeah, that's where we are. And the problem is, like, what's going to give your life most meaning, and this gets back to my Why Judaism piece, is actually the obligations you can't get out of, right? Things that you may have chosen, like family or military service or something, but at the end of the day, it's the irrevocable decisions and commitments that will actually give you the most meaning and purpose in life, right? And so it's odd that we have an entire political philosophy that's oriented towards giving you a lifestyle that's going to make you unhappy or make you feel unfulfilled. Yeah, that is a problem.
In a separate experience, like, it's hard to kind of place things in the COVID timeline, but there was kind of still COVID going on, certainly in Massachusetts. And when I did this book tour, kind of when people were still somewhat social distancing in the middle of the winter of, I guess, 2022 or 1, I can't remember anymore. And it must have been 22. And I went to Boston and gave a talk to MBAs from Harvard and MIT. And I spoke about this notion of economic responsibility and personal responsibility to empower other people to be economically involved, and talked about kind of some of the religious underpinnings of this, particularly in Protestantism and Judaism. And some guy says to me, raises his hand, he goes, now imagine this, it's like 0 degrees, it's freezing. Everyone's bundled up because you can't be indoors. Half the people are in masks in this freezing weather. And he says to me, there's like 100 people gathered around, he says, hey, what do you say to somebody like me whose parents went to synagogue and church, but I'm not interested anymore, and I don't do that? And so I asked him how old he was. He was kind of in his later 30s, getting his MBA. And I said, hey, where have you worked before your MBA? He said, well, I worked at this startup and that startup and the other startup. I said, how long have you spent in the startup? He says, no more than 2 years. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I'd call that a job hopper. And he said, no, that's just the way we do this. And I said, and are you married? No. You have a significant other? No. So is the problem with the synagogue and the church, or do you got like a commitment problem? And there was like this dead silence there on some level. And I think, what?
Wow, that sounds so awkward.
It was kind of awkward, right? But I think part of the question becomes, in modern society, particularly with digital divides, and I don't mean that individual divide, people who have access to digital and those who don't, but I don't have to see you. We don't have to sit next to each other. We sit on the other side of a Zoom, and there's like digital divides. It's like, can we get people to commit and take responsibility for other people and things like that?
I don't know. I think it's hard. I mean,
I think it's hard.
Yeah. I mean,
I know it's politically incorrect, right?
Is it?
I don't know.
Probably not in this forum. Yeah. I mean, I mean, this is going to be super techy. I was warned to be slightly not so techy, but I wrote again, getting back to Balaji's network state, I wrote a review of it for Tablet Magazine, which is a Jewish publication, called "Would You Die for the DAO?" And the DAO is a decentralized autonomous.
Wait, let's just back up 1 second.
Yeah.
Give 60 seconds on what the network state is. I know you kind of explained it before.
Yeah, well, again, it's this notion of an archipelago, an urban archipelago of cities like cities you just named, and the fact that it's going to be its own sort of nation state, so to speak, and people will opt into it. And again, it sounds ludicrous, but then I thought on my life, it's like, well, I basically live in the network state. I just don't call it as such, right? Which of course doesn't mean it actually exists in reality, because getting back, would you die for it? Is it something you would raise your kids in? Do you have a sense of identity with it? Believe it or not, in tech, there's actually a couple of nation-state startups, the Praxis Society, a few others, in which they like, for real, they've raised money, Peter Thiel, Founders Fund, like real VCs, to basically go take over some piece of land. Well, there's Prospera in Honduras. They've basically taken over a piece of land that's legislated as a special economic zone, or is even semi-autonomous, and they try to create a new country as a startup nation, not in the Israeli sense, but in the sort of literal sense.
So the piece you wrote for Tablet said, would anyone die for the nation state?
Right.
Why is that an important litmus test?
Because again, I mean, talk about unchosen obligations. That's one of the most unchosen obligations. Like literally, the barbarian appears and you have to defend and the sense of belonging that you would die for an abstract entity. Right? It's the most unnatural thing.
Trumpeldor, who's one of the great Zionist writers, had this line, which I think would make people cringe today, in which he said, "It is good to die for our land." I wonder if you asked like a lot of people today. We did a poll of this audience. We want to ask you, what would people die for? What would it be?
Yeah, I mean, other than their children, which is the obvious one, right?
Right.
I don't think we've gotten to the point where people won't die for their children. But beyond that, what would they die for? It's probably not much. Yeah.
And is that the litmus test of what's important?
I think it's one bar. Yeah, it's one KPI, to use product manager language. Yes.
Let's turn to Miami for a second. So Miami didn't exist on my map or your map, I'd argue, other than the fact that you were born here,
Right.
as a technology and investment city
Right.
until 18 months ago.
Something like that. Beginning of COVID. It was that Suarez tweet with Delian. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like this mayor breathed into existence, and full disclosure, Mayor Suarez and I are friendly, but like he breathed into existence a new economic reality potentially for Miami, and people kind of gathered around the campfire for him. Why?
I mean, there's a long history of that in Miami, right? Like, I always tell people, like, again, they constantly ask me, because I'm somehow the ambassador to Silicon Valley of Miami, because I was raised here, and there aren't that many people from Miami in tech. It's like, dude, Florida is like the land grift that worked out, right? Because, like, literally the Julia Tuttle Causeway here, you know who Julia Tuttle was, or why anyone who went to high school in Florida knows, she sent the famous apocryphal, really, oranges to Henry Flagler, who is Rockefeller's right-hand man at Standard Oil, and convinced them to actually move his orange groves and all his developments further south. He's the one who built the railroad to Key West. If you drive down to the Keys, you'll see the ruins of it on the right. And so, Mayor Suarez saying, how can I help at a Founders Fund founder versus Julia Tuttle sending oranges to Flagler, same story, right? Just all over again. And so I think part of, can Miami become a tech hub? I think it's definitely the capital of capital, to quote Suarez's thing. It always has been. Is there a builder culture here? That's where, to me, it gets a little bit more mysterious. I'm not sure. Life's a little bit too fun and the weather's a little bit too pleasant here, possibly, for staying inside and staring at screens for 16 hours a day. New York might be also too fun, by the way, to be clear. I think San Francisco has, I think there's, it's just funny, when I was writing Chaos Monkeys, I have an EU passport. I was like, I'm actually going to go and move to Europe. Unlike all these Americans who threatened to move to Europe, I actually moved to Europe. And so I lived in Barcelona and Berlin and checked out the tech scenes, because I assumed I'd write this book and I'd get canceled in tech and never go back again, which didn't really happen. But I was there in Berlin and Barcelona, and their startup scenes are not nearly anything like the American ones are, right? Like, Americans do capitalism as like a blood sport and religion, and Europeans do it like a hobby, right? Like, it's just not the same league. And I was trying to figure out, like, what is missing? And there's a few necessary delusions that you need to have a tech scene. One is like this historical amnesia that you just don't know how things were solved in the past. And we right now in front of this computer are going to reinvent a new industry, and that's it. And you actually go and do it. And of course, 100 people try it, 99 fail, but one becomes Uber and Airbnb. And speaking of moving to Spain, I was living in a series of Airbnbs in Barcelona, and like, Airbnb has kind of wrecked Barcelona way more than, the nationalist troops did during the Civil War, right? Like, literally, all of old Barcelona has been wrecked. It's just a bunch of idiot English lagerlouts like drunkenly staying in Airbnbs. The place is a zoo because of what a bunch of Airbnb kids who went through Y Combinator, this incubator thing that my company also went through, and started on 8th Street and Howard right there in San Francisco. They started a thing that had international impact, right? Like, yeah, it sounds ridiculous, we're going to change the world, but it turns out a subset of founders will change the world. You need to have the capital that is willing to invest and take these wild larks. In Europe, old money tends to be slow, it's sleepy, it doesn't take risks, it likes its little lifestyle, it doesn't invest. And then you need to have outcomes. You need to have M&A, like you need to get bought or have an IPO or liquidity of some form, which again also doesn't happen in Europe. But that said, who knows? Like you go to San Francisco now, San Francisco's kind of a wreck. And I think Silicon Valley is almost more of a state of a mind than it is a place. San Francisco used to have it all. Like I went through the first Web 2 boom in 2010 with my own startup. And it's like, it had the talent there, it had the capital, it had the city and urban life, it had the nature on the weekends. It was all there and it was buzzing and hopping and it felt like you were on the frontier, right? And it all kind of died and got wrecked with COVID. Now you can do a startup anywhere. You can get funds in lots of places. The talent, I wouldn't say it's everywhere, but it's still scattered all over. I don't know. I think it's been kind of decomposed. I think Silicon Valley has become kind of a network state. And there's 3 or 4 cities where you could create world-class technology. Tel Aviv is probably one of them. New York, San Francisco, a few other ones you can think of. That's kind of about it, right?
My observation for what it's worth about the startup scene, tech scene in Israel is that similar to California, which was a state that was willed into existence by pioneers, Israel is a state willed into existence by pioneers who just built and built and built, and it's still a state in creation. I mean, it's young, it's 74 years old. And so by building a startup, you're not just willing a startup into the world, you're willing the next kind of brick on the state of Israel into existence. And in the early 90s, when the capital arrived, due to a government program, one of the only government programs that's ever existed to kind of produce capital, the government insured basically 50% of the losses of like the first 10 venture capital funds to start up in the 90s. And that birthed the venture capital industry in Israel and the capital stack to get there. And then you have this kind of military system where, because there's a compulsory draft, the military has the choice of the best and brightest in Israel, and they can put these kids through a tech education in the military that turns them out kind of hungry for bear and super technologically sophisticated. But it's all part of a state of mind of which, if I build it, it will happen. And just because somebody's tried this before, he was an idiot or didn't have all the tools or the timing was bad, and therefore I can do this. And ironically, I think the kind of more responsibility we give young people at an earlier age, the better they are at kind of willing that stuff into existence.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, with that, we'll open up the floor to questions.
Is yelling really better than the mic? Okay, I'll keep on yelling.
Go ahead, make sure you yell back there.
Yeah, so do you think
What's your name?
My name's Warren. Do you think there's any level of corruption and mismanagement in San Francisco that will break the network effect there?
Oh yeah, it's horribly corrupt. Yes. The San Francisco has the second highest municipal budget in the United States after New York, and it's a little city of 700,000 people, right? And somehow it has an $11 billion budget. And where does it go? The place looks like a ruin because there's an entire nonprofit, homeless industrial complex that eats all of it and produces no results, and there's no accountability, and it's bizarre. And again, you can turn this into a tech criticism, which is supervisor elections there get won by 5,000 votes with campaign budgets of $50,000. How the hell hasn't somebody big gotten in there and sort of straightened it out? I don't know. It's a long story. I won't bore you with what my theories are. Yeah, I think there's massive corruption in San Francisco. And on the one hand, the city treats tech very poorly, right? I doubt that Wall Street gets treated that way in New York or the petroleum industry in Houston. It's treated like this horrible affliction. And literally every city in the world is trying to recreate what San Francisco has. And the city more or less pissed it away, basically, in COVID. And here we are. Yeah.
Ironically, by the way, I think part of what's interesting right now is because talent is so mobile, being tech friendly will matter more than ever. I think that's, potentially clearly so, but things tend to last longer than you think they do. Anytime there's a problem in anything, big institutions, states, concentrations of economic power they always last longer than we think they do.
Yeah, and then look, to do what's called steel manning instead of strong, like take the other side of it. Why? Well, that's true. Then why is San Francisco constantly bouncing back, right? Because I've seen several cycles come and go. So yeah, what is the steel man case for San Francisco? I mean, to be honest, it's kind of this mismanaged wreck of a city that has no real industry anymore outside than tech. So if you work in tech, you can kind of take it over. So there's a lot of AI, like there's a bunch of AI enthusiasm in San Francisco. There's a bunch of businesses there that they've taken over one part of the city. They're building little hacker houses. Like things are kind of moving, and you can do that. Tech can throw its weight around, and I think you would get kind of lost in the shuffle. Even in Miami, there's a lot going on in Miami, and in New York, there's an enormous amount going on. Like in San Francisco, there isn't that much going on, frankly. And if you're like a techie, you're AI, like suddenly you are in center stage, right? And so that's maybe the bull case for San Francisco. Also, the nature is gorgeous. That's one of the things. Northern California is basically like paradise, and so it's easy to get young people to move there with the wine country, surfing, skiing, all the rest of it. Like, as much as I'm trash talking of San Francisco, Northern California broadly is absolutely stunning. Right?
Hi, my name's Rodolfo Milani, and I have two short questions. One is, what do you think of the current reparations proposal in San Francisco, and you know, the cost of it? And the second question is, did you guys bring copies of your books for us to buy?
What is reparations proposal? I'm not even familiar with that.
You're kidding! You should read about it. It's a huge reparations, for slavery proposal that's literally so expensive that you just can't even imagine. And they're supposed to vote on it, and I thought you would know all about it.
I mean, there's so much crazy in California that a lot of it gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. So I might have missed reparation news. As for books, I don't know. I think they mentioned something about having our books here, but I'm not sure if they're.
I know I have to ask Francisco that question. Otherwise, it's on Amazon.
Yeah, it's on Amazon or wherever.
And you'll have it tomorrow.
Yeah, but not signed. That's not by you.
That's true. We send you a network state virtual signature.
An NFT. Okay.
An NFT, that's exactly NFT. Exactly.
Well played.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Jonathan. As you see decaying institutions, you see the fracturing happening. You don't really see the build. What is the prognosis of building it back together, right? So you see fracturing. There were institutions that led to Silicon Valley, called educational institutions. They created the talent pool. That may no longer be sufficient. In Miami, you've had a fracture where you have a capital pool here, but maybe you don't have the builders, you don't have the infrastructure there. Israel, you have a lot of that historically. What is the prognosis as you go forward?
Prognosis for what specifically?
For a solving of the decaying institutions, or is it as you said, burn them down and build what? Or how do you guys see it out?
Like Antonio, I kind of vacillate on this question. I think there's a set of institutions that probably needs to just be burnt down and replaced. Let's use an example from the pandemic. The WHO is one of these, right? There's a pile of these institutions that have been captured by people that are kind of not aligned. But I don't think we can kind of persist in society without institutions that serve real coordination functions. And so, in my own head, the real question is, what are the long-term principles that we want to build these new institutions on or reform existing institutions based on? And the second part of it is, institutions tend to get captured because the people in them, or let's just say the people out of them, don't have enough time to spend on these important institutions. And part of the kind of civic commitment or bill of responsibilities is busy people who are off making a living and doing what they have to do actually need to get involved in these places and bring capable talents to bear on them. Because when you leave it to the people who have agendas and all the time in the world because they're funded by third parties, you end up where we have ended up in many of these cases. So I think there's an opportunity to do organizational recapture by people who actually have skin in the game and kind of real stake. But it takes commitment. It's time and energy and money.
Yeah, I don't know. Like you, I often vacillate. Like I often ask myself the question: are elites now just like worse than they used to be, or is social media just an X-ray machine for elites, and we just see things we didn't see before? If you read more kind of unvarnished histories of World War II, all sorts of mistakes. Like even what we would hold up as our glory period as a nation, you could see all sorts of mistakes. And similarly in the Yom Kippur War and in Israel, there's always been massive screw-ups, right, of various forms. And often I ask myself, are they really that bad? I think it's a little bit of both. I think actually elites are worse now than they used to be, but I think part of it's also just a lot of it gets spun via the social media mechanism. Yeah, I'm not sure how to rebirth those institutions.
I will add one thing to it when I tell you to say right now, which is partially because of social media, or just because of digital connectivity. Digital connectivity is frictionless. And so all cycles have sped up. Economic cycles have sped up, news cycles have sped up, people cycles have sped up, but institutions, which are built on a different operating system, haven't sped up as much. And so there's kind of, think about, two tectonic plates, when one's running 100 miles an hour and the other at 10 miles an hour, there's going to be friction there. And I think that's part of what's going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the truths about startups, like any startup that has an actual problem, everyone, like the amateur move is to think that it's like a software or a tech problem.
100%.
And then like, oh, we have to solve the tech problem. It's like, no, every major problem in a startup is a human problem, right? The management is screwed up, the CEO is confused, like there's something broken, it's a human problem. But then the amateur entrepreneur will try to fix the technical problem because it's a thing they can easily fix, but the human problems are actually way harder to fix. So like, I published a lot, and eventually it drove me so crazy, I went back to tech. Like the whole Facebook news cycle post-Trump 2016, blaming Facebook and Russiagate, all this bullshit. Like as if you could fix Facebook or put it back in the bottle. There's no fixing Facebook. There's no fixing Twitter. There's no content moderation algorithm that's going to make it all great and feel like Dan Rather reading the news in the 80s. Like that world is never happening, right? We have to create social and political and cultural institutions that like are still like commensurate with, having the entire world like refracted through this phone. If you're not willing to accept that, you're kind of like basically living in a form of nostalgia, right? Because Luddites, rejecting technology, or to drop a Dune reference, the Balerian Jihad of like, oh, we're just gonna like not use this technology and build society that way, is never happening, right? And so we just have to build institutions that can survive the smartphone, and we don't have them basically.
To the comment this woman made before, one of my ongoing discussions in Israel is with, it's called conservative rabbis, conservative with a small c, rabbis who think that they can control the tech genie.
Right.
It's just not happening. And, deeply conservative religious institutions need to face up to the fact that everyone's got access to information, will have access to information. Yes, you can kind of hold it back 5-10 years maybe, right, but ultimately it's there. And if you don't build the kind of human resilience to deal with this, it's going to wreak more havoc than ever. Just like the printing press, by the way, did 500 years ago.
It surprises me that seems so un-Jewish to reject technology that way.
I've been making that argument.
If you talk to Chabad is this sort of movement inside Judaism. They make much of the fact that they had one of the first websites in like 1993 or whatever, before any media company had a website. And so,
You have a question?
Yeah, I did.
I saw your hand up from the kind of corner.
Yeah, no worries. I was quick. No, I actually.
You don't have to ask one. It's okay.
No. Yeah, I just want to say you addressed that in your previous statement.
Okay. Sure.
So why can't we fix the algorithms? Why is that impossible? Why can't we just, somebody try to pierce the media bubbles that we're all living in, and I think perpetuate a lot of this? Why is it?
Two very simple answers to your question. One, we're actually not living in media bubbles. I think part of the problem is actually we're exposed to contrary opinion in a way that we weren't in the past. When I was growing up in Miami, if you wanted to read the New York Times, you had to find a physical copy of it, and it was actually hard to find. And what's coming out of the New York Times was very different than the default, like Reagan Republicanism that was the political default in Miami in the 80s. And so I think actually on the contrary, we're not living in filter bubbles. On the contrary, we're constantly exposed to people who have political and moral foundations that are different than ours, and it drives us crazy. And I think it's unhealthy. You shouldn't have to sit there and try to explain your moral framework and defend it, 24/7. I think that's part of what's driving people crazy. As to like, why aren't the algorithms part of it? Case in point, WhatsApp. WhatsApp has in fact credibly been associated with political violence in India and Brazil and all sorts of like nefarious stuff that actually was organized through WhatsApp. There's no algorithm. Facebook doesn't manage anything. It's actually encrypted end to end. All it literally is the instant ability of people to, one person to talk to anybody else in the world and spread the message instantly. That's all it takes. There's no algorithms, right? There's nothing you're going to tweak. I mean, at the margin, can you tweak the knobs to make it slightly less inflammatory or slightly less biased? Sure, potentially, no question. But do I think it's going to radically change the course of technology history? No, I really do not think it will.
So I have a slightly different perspective. Maybe it's an extension of that perspective. Because we're exposed to so many things we find jarring to our political view, I think we actually have tended to retreat into our own filter bubbles. I call this in my book, the Tower of Babel. Now, I think that Jonathan Haidt published this piece in The Atlantic of his own interpretation of the Tower of Babel, which I think is biblically incorrect, but an important point nonetheless. the story of the Tower of Babel is not that people couldn't communicate with each other. It's that they all had the same language and they had unfettered communication. And it's in fact this kind of instant unfettered communication where everybody thinks like me that causes me to kind of be able to retreat into a bubble. So these WhatsApp groups is basically my retreat from interaction with things that I find kind of difficult into a way that I can kind of get with unbelievable speed a good feeling that I'm part of a group that's actually trying to do something about this right now. And the issue on the algorithm is not, do I hear something different or hear the same thing? The real question is speed of communication. We don't have cooling off periods anymore, right? We send our kids when they get kind of bent out of shape, go time out, cool off. But if I'm in a WhatsApp group where messages are going like 1,000,000 miles an hour, there's no cooling off period. And when I think I got to respond because I see somebody about to comment on something online and you go, oh my God, I better get in there first. You don't cool off and think for a second. So what we really need is time to think and have these physical conversations. And I think actually what's missing is actually this physical meeting where you have to measure your words and look people in the eyes and it not be instant. Like right now, it's got to zip around the world. And because this is being videoed, whatever I say now is going to be zipped around the world afterwards. I've lost total control of this because it's videoed. But if we have a private conversation, you can kind of breathe and think and have a conversation.
I mean, yeah, well, okay, I won't comment. Go ahead, let's ask more questions. Okay.
You don't like that?
It's okay. Let's go ahead.
No, you can argue.
No, well, I'm in a bunch of groups now, right? Like, I think we all are, right? I agree with you. It's kind of a retreat, but I would say that it has exactly the features you're saying, right? Like this panel is moderated. If someone behaved in some crazy way, they'd like kick them out and stuff, right? And then like you said, like there's personal skin in the game. Me, AGM is right here talking to you. Like I can't engage in outrageous behavior because it's like totally untoward and I've been trained not to do it, right? And that's what's missing online. But I think I block lots of people like crazy on Twitter. If I block you on Twitter, I'm sorry. I have like a hair trigger block thing on Twitter. And I think constructing those walls where you're not constantly on guard, like you can actually be a lot more candid and real and have much more real conversations in a lot of these small groups than you can in public, right? And so I agree, there's something missing there. But I think the closer we create digital media that mimics real life media, I think that is better.
100%.
I think some of the things about these first, I think we'll look back on the early days of social media and say, man, that was a fucking mistake, right? Like this business of having Twitter feel conversational and chatty, but then being stored forever and searchable such that the stupid tweet you did 10 years ago can get you fired now. Like that's totally dumb, right? Because obviously some things are meant to be ephemeral and not last forever. And I wouldn't speak in a conversational media the same way I would write an editorial for the New York Times, right? And they shouldn't be judged the same, right? So that's clearly a design flaw in social media. So I think we just need to design better mechanisms to, like humans aren't like these crazy sociopaths. You just put them in situations and they behave in negative ways. And I think social media does that to a lot of people. I've lost a lot of friends to Twitter brain, let's put it that way, who they've become Twitter media celebrities and now all they can do is like babble in little memes and like they're gone, right? And
I will say, by the way, that because all this stuff gets stored, it actually gets harder for people to change their minds.
right.
And we actually should change our minds because facts change.
Okay, so there are hands. Yeah.
With respect to AI, can you talk about the creator economy and how information and content will be transformed in the next X years, decades?
Go ahead. You're the VC.
Three comments. One, I actually think it's going to put a significant economic premium on creativity. The more creative you are, meaning unmimicable by some basic forms of AI, the more valuable you will become as an innovator, creator, creative genius. So that's kind of point one. Point two, there was a piece today that apparently ChatGPT passed the Wharton entrance exam. Education is going to need to change. I'm actually working with a group of young people in Israel right now in an era where I can submit an essay and the teacher probably has no idea whether it was created by ChatGPT or not, even though I don't think ChatGPT is that far along, but I still think most teachers actually can't tell that it is. one of the skills we're going to teach kids, and I think it's really important, we can actually teach them to try to distinguish what's real, what's created, what's really creative, et cetera. So critical thinking is actually going to be at a big premium also going forward. And I think, by the way, it's been watered down for a variety of reasons over the last decade or two. So critical thinking, I think, becomes more important. The last thing is the value of really great content is going to zero because it'll be ubiquitous. And so that moves value from creation to curation. And I think curation is going to become significantly more valuable. All that having been said, I think a lot of the scary headlines of AI are ahead of their time right now. It doesn't mean it won't get there, but it's still way ahead of its time. Much like I thought 5 years ago that all the scary headlines about autonomous vehicles were way ahead of their time. And I still think it's about 15 years ahead of time right now.
It turns out the scary headlines are almost always wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
How much of the economic activity we're talking about is really going to produce enduring value? And how much of it is maybe a byproduct of something like the easy credit money policies that we've had over the past many years, right? So you mentioned out of the 100 entrepreneurs, most of whom fail, you've got a couple of successes, Uber and Airbnb. They've got long-term problems with being profitable companies that just do what successful companies have usually done.
True. Yeah, a lot of things turn out to be zero interest rate phenomenon, actually. So we start seeing things die out. It's possible. I mean, one of the things that does nag me about this new or techno entrepreneurship is a lot of it's in the software virtual realm, right? It's this form of like, to cite a Christian heresy, Gnosticism, right? This thought that like the spiritual realm defeats the physical realm, and that we should just
Software eats the world.
Right, it's like the singularity, the transhumanism people. The people who want to upload their brains to a computer is like taken seriously in Silicon Valley, by the way. You can't make fun of it. A lot of people are actually looking for it. It reads like an evangelical sermon about the rapture, but whatever, right? There are clearly religious overtones to it. And I do wonder that like we're really creating castles in the air. My own company works in like literally the most ephemeral thing in the world. It's like, it's trying to count pixels written on bits that interact with human brains that have been basically virtualized. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's this whole American dynamism business about reshoring manufacturing and stuff, which I think is interesting. But yeah, I don't know how it plays software versus hardware and making actual things.
Okay, so I think there's two parts to your question. One is how much of the economic value created in the called technology industry is lasting versus how much is bad business models propped up by cheap money. The second question is what I think Antonio kind of addressed right now is how much does it actually impact our lives? So in the first question, I think historically there's been 2 or 3 companies a year backed by venture capital that matter. And in the last 8 years, there's been 15. And that was an anomaly. And we'll go back to having 3 companies that matter. The venture business is a home run business. It's not a home run, it's a grand slam home run business, in which most of your investments fail. I published this so you can go read it. I did a blog which summarized our annual letters between 2018 and 2022, the letters that I write every year to our limited partners, in which it says, letter after letter, there's too much money sloshing around in the market. It can't be that we have no companies that have failed. Something is wrong, and this will end. It did. I think we will go back to having 2 or 3 or 4 companies every year that matter. I think there'll be more now because it's more global, but it's not 15, 20. And those companies matter. And this is kind of the second point, which is try to imagine your world without, communications, which Cisco, a venture-backed company, or without the iPhone today, Apple, a venture-backed company, or without Google, a venture-backed company, or without Instagram for those who have an account. I don't. And productivity that comes out of software. And this, I think, is a key point, which is there's a lot of things we can do because we virtualize them that improve productivity, improve connectivity, that matter to our modern lives in a way that wasn't true in the past. All that having been said, I think we've lost the focus on what matters, and this has been a huge theme of my investing. You can read about it in the book and on my blog, etc. I have this thesis called long humanity, which is innovation that actually improves human beings' lives on a day-to-day basis has been neglected, in my view, over the years, and it's kind of been an investment theme of mine. And I think there will be more of that. Whether it's how do we reduce the cost of healthcare, because it's ridiculous, and do that through kind of using digital technologies. I have an investment in a company called Empathy, which deals with how to next of kin deal with people who passed away, because this is a giant corrupt industry, particularly in the United States. It's tens of billions of dollars of how people who are grieving have to go through hell after they've already gone through hell. And I think we need kind of more and more innovations, and software can help with that. And I'll finish with one interesting comment, because Antonio talked about people uploading their brains to the cloud. So I actually have a personal investment in a company that literally uploads people's brains to the cloud. But it's an amazing story of a guy with a child who had mental challenges, who figured out that you can create this device that you put on people's head, and if you train in the cloud a model of a person's brain for how to do proper motor movements, etc., you can, using an EEG machine, re-download it from the cloud and improve people's mental and physical capacity. And now they're treating stroke victims and bringing them back to full motor skills by uploading normative brains to the cloud, training them on the person, and re-downloading them. So there's a lot of stuff we can do by uploading brains to the cloud that actually help human beings.
We got time for one more question.
The company's called BrainQ, by the way.
Hey there, thanks for being here tonight. Antonio, you were talking about some of the different cities and the factors that go into a successful tech ecosystem. Plenty of capital here, and some of the other aspects of that. And then thinking also in a separate thread of the transients around both the past couple of years around COVID, as well as just in tech in general. If you're building software, you can do it from a computer anywhere. If you were over in Europe doing that too, like you can move around. And so thinking about those two forces, what should Miami be thinking about as opposed to further establish itself as a place that tech can be built and scaled?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, like I said, I think Silicon Valley has been deconstructed, right? There are several elements that SF had during its golden period. Again, talent, capital, the urban vibe, natural setting, right?
And universities.
And then, I think the university story also helps. I don't know that Miami has to be all of those things. I was probably in Miami 6 to 8 times last year, right? It's definitely a center of gravity. You run into people here, you meet people here. One of our investors is here from Coinbase. One of the biz dev guys that we work with is here. It's become a center of gravity. I don't know that it has to be more than that necessarily to be a success. I don't think you have to have the next unicorn with 3,000 employees founded in Miami. That'd be a nice success story. It's great if it's true. But frankly, just having here's how a lot of companies work now, right? I think fully remote is a model that can work. Our startup isn't doing it. What we do is typically we recruit from a certain set of cities and then meet in those cities or all meet in some other city. Girlfriend, for example, has a totally remote startup, and they always go to some city and then convene there for a week or two and jam, get to know each other, all the things you would normally do in person. Miami would be a perfect city for that, right? Nice weather, fun, exciting, dynamic. You just get off the plane, it's kind of cool, has a neat vibe. Just be that. You don't have to reproduce. Nobody's going to reproduce the San Francisco magic again. I just don't think it's happening. I don't think San Francisco's going to reproduce it. I don't think Miami is either. And so just be an interesting center of gravity where lots of mover and shakers live, some capital, you have conferences. That would already to me be a success story.
I think actually conferences matter a lot. It's one of my takeaways from the pandemic is that we missed that ability to kind of convene people who know a lot about the same topic. CES was bustling this year. I don't think that's an accident. I think conferences actually matter a huge amount these days.
And it's not even necessarily the conference itself. I've gone to 3 crypto conferences and I was an idiot and bought the ticket. I never even got my tag. I never even went inside the conference center. It's all the side meeting and events 100%. Around it. It's basically literally everyone agreeing to show up in the same city at once. Exactly. That's all the conference is. The speaking panels basically don't matter. And so I think it's very easy to get people to show up in Miami now. And I think that's perfectly a fine target for Miami to be.
Great. Thank you, Antonio, for coming.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to end it.
Cool. Thanks,
Thanks for being here. Thanks for spending some time in Miami. You know, as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about, I think it was maybe one of Tom Wolfe's last books, Back to Blood, where he talked about Miami as the city of the future. I think he was a little prescient. I also want to thank a few people here. Tom and Max, they might have checked you in. They are college students at the University of Miami, go Canes, and they're in the business school, and they also found us because they have an economic club they're a part of on campus. So thank you, Tom and Max, for being I just want to thank Antonio and Michael again, and we'll. This is going to be on YouTube. You share with your friends. For those of you who are interested in joining the club, again, shoot us an email. I'm going to also send out a survey about the event, what you thought about it, all sorts of things, but also what you would like us to see us do more of in the future. All of entrepreneurial activities about feedback, so I really encourage you to reply to some of the surveys we'll put out later this week on that, and some of the future. I'm really excited about being part of this, and glad that everybody here is part of it as well. So thank you for joining us this evening, and hope you all have a great night.
Thank you.